Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Melissa Baker, and welcome to our NCC 2022 update. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of changes that have been happening, and we still, as Russ will tell you, don't 100% know the full story, but we're going to update you with what we know to this point, and hopefully you'll be able to ask any questions towards the end, if there's anything that's not as clear as you'd like it to be by the end of the session. So welcome. We are recording this session. It will go up on our website, so you will be able to access it. You will also be given an attendance for attending today, which will give you a 1 CPD point for turning up. At this point, everybody will be on mute. At the end of the session, we'll have time for questions. So if you'd like to speak, you will be able to use your raise hand function, or if you type your question in the comments, I can read it out for you. So one of the panelists can answer your question for you. If something does come up during the presentation, please just type them into the question and answer function. If it's appropriate, the panelist that is speaking will answer at that time. If not, they will leave it until the end. So the panelists that we've got today are Russell Harris, Clinton Skeok, and Poya Abtahi. We'll be talking to you over the course of today. Thanks, Russ. So we start off with our content, will be our NCC 2022 adoption and key dates for you, the volume structure, SPTC referencing structure, livable housing, energy efficiency, and then other matters, followed by reference standards, the next steps, and then finishing up with our Q&A session. So to start it all off today, I'd like to introduce you probably all know, and welcome Russell Harris to start the proceedings for today. Thanks, Russ.
Great, thanks, Mel. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. Hopefully we can answer more questions than we ask, but looking forward to the discussion at the end of the presentation to bring it home. I guess sorry, I just learned how to drive again. The burning question, or the most immediate question, is when do all these changes come into effect? And NCC 2022, the ABCB, Australian Building Code Board, have agreed on, have proposed, and the building ministers have agreed on a transition plan for the implementation of NCC 2022. So, as you know, through the course of this year, we've had stage 1 and stage 2 of the previews published. The building ministers in August agreed to the publication, or making available, was I think the term they used, of the full NCC 2022 on the 1st of October. So it's currently available and can be downloaded from the Australian Building Code Board's website. The transition plan that was agreed on by the state ministers was for an implementation, or a mandate coming into effect as of 1st of May for all of the provisions except for energy, condensation, and livable housing. Those elements would be have a delayed adoption to the 1st of October 2023. So effectively 6 and 12-month introduction. Now, that's not to say that they can't be used at this point. The NCC 2022 is in effect, but it's not mandatory. So the easiest way to say is compliance with NCC 2022 at this moment is voluntary, but will become mandatory as of the 1st of May, at least according to the building ministers meeting. But Australia is based on a federation, which means we have 3 levels of government. We have federal, state, and local. And the National Construction Code is brought into effect by state legislation. It's not a federal document, even though it's called the National Construction Code. It's brought into effect by the state legislation and can be varied by state. So what we now have is we have a federal transition plan, but we have state variations or state announcements as to what their intentions are. So what you can see here is that Queensland and Victoria have gone on the record and announced that they will adopt the national plan. So 1st of May adoption for all of the general provisions. We've called them general provisions because it's too hard to say everything but condensation, energy and livable housing. So the general provisions is in May, and the 3 elements, condensation, energy and livable housing, in October. New South Wales is following the same plan, but has opted out of the livable housing provision. So they will not be adopting livable housing in NCC 2022 as a state variation. Tasmania have a similar kind of variation. They will also adopt the general provisions in May. The condensation provisions will be adopted in October as per the national plan, but there will be a further 12-month delay on the livable housing, so October 2024, and they will not be implementing the energy efficiency provisions. Western Australia has just announced their variations. They had provided an announcement a couple of weeks ago, a few weeks ago now. They've updated that with a bit more detail, just I think on Friday. So Western Australia has a legislative framework that provides a 12-month adoption timeframe for pretty much any change that occurs in the NCC. So that they will be applying that over and above the nationally agreed transition. So that means that basically everything follows 12 months later. So the general provisions will be applicable from the 1st of May 2024. And the condensation and energy provisions will be applicable from the 1st of May 2025. Now, there's an asterisk next to that, just to clarify that there are some elements of the energy provisions for low-rise, I can't remember if it's low-rise, I think it's high-rise apartment buildings. Some of those provisions will, a varied set of parameters will come in. As I said, this was only announced on Friday, so we're still working through what all these changes mean, but effectively speaking, that all of the provisions will come in on May 2025 with a limited application prior to that. They will not be moving ahead with or implementing the livable housing provisions. Northern Territory will adopt NCC 2022 on the 1st of May 2023 in line with the rest of the country. But they've varied the application of the energy efficiency provisions so that they won't be adopting the NCC 2022 energy provisions, but what they will be doing is bringing forward the 2019 commercial building section J provisions. So the commercial building provisions that were adopted a couple of years ago for the rest of the country, they will be now the requirement in Northern Territory. Australian Capital Territory and South Australia are yet to make any formal announcements. We do have more information coming out on this, and we will obviously keep the industry informed as changes happen. So keep an eye on social media, our website and news, and of course our monthly EDMs, because we'll be obviously publishing updates as they occur in real time. So what are the key changes? The first thing you notice is that there's 2 new books. The NCC itself is still 3 volumes, volume 1 and 2, making up the Building Code of Australia, and volume 3 being the Plumbing Code, and not of any significance to us, obviously. But there's 2 new supplementary standards. The first one's called the Housing Provisions Standard, and the second one's called the Livable Housing Standard. You've heard me talk about the implementation of the livable housing. So we'll work through what the requirements are in each of those. But with regard to the housing provisions, the Housing Provisions Standard is all the stuff from volume 2 that was very prescriptive. So all the diagrams, the illustrations, the recipe type, very prescriptive how-to provisions, they've been moved out of the National Construction Code into a separate standalone document called the Housing Provisions Standard. So it's important to understand that basically not everything, but the majority of Section 3 from the old 2019 has moved out to a separate document, and we now have the NCC Volume 2 is Section H. So it's no longer referenced as a 1, 2, 3. It's now Section H. Nice and easy to remember because the H for housing. So within that, we've also got this, what the ABCB call the SPT referencing structure. So it's a new clause nomenclature. So we used to have F 1.6 or B 8.9 or what, all these things. There's now 4 digits to every clause, and it sounds a bit R2D2 C3PO-ish, but every clause has a specific reference structure that tells us quite a bit of information, actually. One thing to note is in NCC 2022, on the right-hand side there, you can see the previous reference. So this particular clause now is now F6D3, was previously known as F6.2. So what does the SPTC stand for? A section part type clause. The section's fairly straightforward. We all know what the sections A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J all are. That's fairly straightforward. And as I said, section H is now the housing volume, the bulk of volume 2. The part is just the part numbering, so that makes sense. The type is a new addition. That's kind of the bit that sort of is most valuable and the newest sort of the addition. And it's basically that you can be O, F, P, or V, or D or G. So the most obvious one is a P, stands for a performance requirement. So this is the mandatory thing that you have to meet. So anything that has a P there is the governing principle or the requirement. A D indicates a deemed to satisfy provision. So if it's D, we know what that means. It's a deemed to satisfy solution. So having that clarity to be able to differentiate what is a performance requirement, what is a DTS solution, what is a verification method. These are all very important things that were kind of unclear under the old structure. So it's good to have that clarified. And the clause is obviously just the specific clause referenced. So this is quite a powerful kind of nomenclature. It does make sense once you get used to it, but it does take you a little bit of getting used to. Other than, I guess, the general principles or things that have changed everywhere, there are 3 specific areas, I guess. And we want to start with livable housing because that's not being implemented in every state, but it is something that is being implemented in most states. And it invokes a couple of changes to be aware of. The first one is in terms of application. Livable housing by definition means, a dwelling. It's applicable to Class 1A buildings or houses and Class 2 single occupancy units. There are already accessibility requirements that relate to other building classes. The livable housing relates only to these 2 classes of buildings. The first and most notable requirement from the livable housing relates to a step-free entrance. So this is fundamentally the threshold. So in every dwelling that's not exempt, there are some exemptions from the livable housing provision, but without going into those, if it's not exempt, the livable housing provisions require that there is at least one step-free entrance into the dwelling. So that means basically from the front boundary of the property right through to the internal of the home needs to be step-free, so that someone can access the home without having to step up a step or a series of steps. That can also mean from an internal garage within the building. So if it's not practical to have the front door accessible, an internal access door would suffice. The requirements that relate to that step-free, and there only needs to be one, is that the door threshold has to be level. If it can't be level, it has to have a height of not more than 5 mil, provided it's rounded or beveled. You can see the kind of language here. It's very kind of standard-ish. Doesn't tell you how to do it, but it tells you what must be done. If there's a rise in height, it can't exceed 56 millimeters, and the gradient for the threshold needs to be no more than 1 in 8. And this last point there, the last dot point right down the bottom, that was added in late based on feedback from, among others, but our industry around concerns that these provisions might compromise the weatherproofing of a front door or any door. And so additional concessions have been provided around a maximum 15 mil lip. So the term lip height is not something that we would use or choose to use, but it basically talks about a vertical height of no more than 15 millimeters, where if none of the other options meet the weatherproofing requirements. The other notable thing about a step-free entrance is a minimum clear opening width, which is 820 millimeters. So that doesn't mean an 820 mil door. You will need a larger door because you need to take into account the hinge, the thickness of the door panel, plus any hardware and protrusions of the jamb. So generally speaking, probably an 870 minimum door, but it's important to verify that. One thing we have had clarified, it's not represented in the livable housing standard, but has certainly been communicated to us, is that doesn't include the door furniture or the door handle if the door is able to open past 105 degrees. So this drawing here, you can see the door sort of laid back against the wall a little bit. Where you can open the door past the sort of 105 degree mark, you don't have to account for or allow for the door furniture. The other thing that's been added, and this was post-public comment, was with regard to the weatherproofing of the opening and a requirement for a threshold grate. This is the illustrations that's been included. We have raised some concerns about this, mostly with regard to the size. I mean, a 200 by 150 mil drainage channel is huge. It's a sort of drainage channel you'd see in a Westfield car park, to be honest, not necessarily across the front door of a home. But this is the requirement that's been drafted and now enacted into the National Construction Code. So yet to see with the impact of this, but it's, other than the overall size, the grate requirements are somewhat consistent with 1428. So there's that. The other thing is, it's, other than a sliding door, it's not, I guess, common for the window or door supplier to provide the drainage grate. So this may or may not affect us, but I guess that all depends on the business model and the products in question. So something to be aware of, and keen for some feedback if this affects you, and how it affects you, and what sort of messaging and response we can take to government in response to this provision. As I said, it did come in quite late and without notice. The other part of the livable housing provisions or standard relates to the shower. So there's really only the two parts that affect us, the step-free entrance and the shower. And the requirements that relate to a shower, we did have originally in the first draft a requirement to have the door of a shower enclosure be removable. That has been taken out in response to the feedback the ABCV received, notably from us. But the hobless and step-free entry has remained. Now, it doesn't say, there's no requirement for it to be a downstairs shower. It just says at least one shower in the dwelling. It does sort of be a source of a bit of confusion if someone who has limited mobility is able to navigate 17 rises in a flight of stairs, but can't step over a 5 mil lip into the shower. But nonetheless, these are the requirements. So at least one shower has to have a lip height of not more than 5 millimeters. And that's hobless step free. So the inside and outside needs to be the same height and no hob in between, or at least more than 5 millimeters. Really, really important to note. And again, it likely doesn't affect us too much, but like all things, we're going to get caught into it. This does induce a very strict conflict with the waterproofing standard AS 3740, which requires, this is an illustration from 3740, requires a minimum 15 millimeter height. So it's unclear as yet how this will be resolved, but we have a conflict in the requirements with regards to the waterproofing and the tiling. Again, we're going to come in and put a shower screen on top of whatever they put down before us. So presumably not going to affect us too much, but again, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, and likewise interested for feedback of how this may be affecting you. Aside from livable housing, probably the next biggest change is the energy efficiency. And I think Clinton's going to talk later in the presentation more about some of the impacts we're seeing in some of the studies investigation we're doing to try and understand exactly what 7-star means in each climate zone. But generally speaking, the NCC 2022 introduces a 7-star stringency level. So that's a 1-star increase from the previous. So to unpack that a little bit, we need to look at the two different volumes. So we'll start with volume 1, which is commercial buildings. In NCC 2019, it's the only pathway for class 2 single occupancy units is an energy rating or a NATERS assessment. So there's no other pathway available currently. So that's quite restrictive, I imagine. So a lot of the changes with regard to the commercial side of things is with regard to class 2s apartments is to introduce the other pathways that are available for pretty much any requirement under the National Construction Code. So basically we have this, performance solution versus deemed to satisfy solution. I'm sure most people would be familiar with this. As it's applied to energy, performance solution generally invokes a verification method, or in this case, most commonly a reference building. The deemed to satisfy solution includes new provisions for elemental provisions, so kind of prescriptive building block type solutions. So they're the two areas that have been introduced, and I'll go through each individually. So starting with the verb methodology, verification using reference building, get used to the J1V5 reference. I imagine this method has proven quite attractive for ESD consultants in the commercial space, and it's reasonable to expect it'll be similarly popular for ESD consultants designing apartments. So we expect this to be used a fair bit. The idea of a reference building is that you build a building that complies with the elemental requirements, and then you design your building to achieve that or better. But it gives you a lot more flexibility to mix and match and try different things. In consideration or in the development of the verb methodology, the ABCB and the working groups that we participated with were very, very careful to eliminate opportunity for gaming. The verb methodology is prone to gaming. It can be misused. So there's been a lot of effort put into the specifications that support that. Primarily that the specifications dictate kind of a minimum stringency level that's equivalent to 7 stars, and then allows the flexibility to design your building as you see fit. Again, this doesn't necessarily directly involve us or change how we do business. We're still going to get specifications in terms of what we're used to, U values and solar heat gains and so forth. This is more about how those numbers are derived or how the building assessment is undertaken. Similarly, the elemental provision. So this is the opposite end of the spectrum. This is an algebraic equation that defines energy efficiency, performance, stringency levels. It's complicated. Basically, it's complex. This is the winter formula. If you game, have a go. For us mere mortals, we'll probably sit back and watch, but there are a few factors in there that are notable. One of them is that the windows in or bedroom and living rooms are treated differently. So based on their occupancy, bedrooms are typically inhabited at nighttime. So the solar gain is not so consequential to the overall energy use of the building or the unit as are the living room areas, for example. The color of the window frame, like the wall and the roof and etc., color can make a big difference to the energy performance. So that's taken into account. And also the occupancy factors. I can't remember what they all are, but it's a complicated formula, and I'm not going to go through it right now. I don't pretend to understand everything in there exactly how it works, but it's it has the corresponding summer values. So this is the solar heat gain values. Again, it takes into account the room type factor, which is its use factor, the frame factor, and the floor area factor. In terms of volume 2, we had a pre-existing verb. So there is currently a verification using reference building method available in 2019. It's not changing. The verb itself isn't changing. What is changing is the increase in stringency to a 7-star equivalent, but also better or tighter specification of what the reference building has to be. And fundamentally, the reference building now needs to meet the DTS provisions. And that's something that was not well aligned in 2019. So that's the improvement there, I suppose, is that, well, the expectation is that buildings designed to a reference building will be much closer to either the elemental provisions or the NATERS assessment than they were previously. And that can mean a fairly sizable stringency increase for some jurisdictions where the verb has been the preferred methodology over NATERS. Likewise, the elemental provisions have been updated. Again, a whole heap of algebra and specifications there. We don't need to know all this sort of stuff. This is just how the numbers are calculated and determined by ESD consultants. I guess the important factor being that the outcome of these formula increases stringency to 7 stars above the current stringency level of 6 stars. What exactly that means will depend on a whole heap of factors that Clinton's going to discuss coming up. As for the general provisions or other matters, there are a number of, I guess, corrections or improvements that have been made. One of the most notable one is the inclusion of aluminium and construction packers in the exempt building elements under C2D10, which is the old C1.9. So this refers to non-combustibility of walls and all their components in Type A and Type B buildings. Previously, aluminium was not listed as an exemption, and therefore we had to prove that aluminium didn't burn. And likewise, the packers that we use commonly in installation, obviously they are flammable, but they're very low mass and inconsequential to the fire protection measures or intention behind the wall. So they've now been exempt. Really important. We're going to share more information on this or better detail in a fact sheet in the next few weeks. But an important thing to note with regard to balustrades is the face-mounted type. There was I guess a misinterpretation or a loophole in the previous provisions that the 125 mil maximum gap applied equally to any gap. But what that could lead to is if you've got a standout face-mounted type balustrade, you could, in theory, stand that off the face of the slab by 125 mil, which meant you had a 125 mil gap straight down. That was certainly not the intent, but you could argue it was permissible under 2019 provisions. So, excuse me. So those provisions have been tightened up so that where a balustrade or barrier is face mounted, the maximum gap from the trafficable surface or the slab out to the balustrade is 40 millimeters. It applies to all balustrades. It's not specific to glass, but obviously glass barriers are probably the most common scenario where that's going to occur. For the wall cladding, so this is commercial buildings, section F. There are new DTS provisions for these three cladding types: masonry, aerated concrete, and metal wall cladding. The significance of that is these DTS solutions, these standards weren't referenced previously, which meant that when a consultant was trying to design a building, an architect was designing a building and they wanted to validate or verify the weatherproofing of the building, the only real way they had to do that was AS 4284, which kind of caught the windows into that dialogue, because if you the test prescribes an entire facade type test, which would include all the openings. There has always been DTS provisions for glazing. They were formerly F1.13, and there were no DTS provisions for the cladding. So to clarify that and to make it to reduce the opportunity for misinterpretation, those provisions have been reordered. So the DTS glazing provisions come first now in F3D4, and immediately after that, the DTS provisions for wall cladding. So it's very clear this is what is required for windows and doors, and this is what's required for cladding. And the DTS provisions for glazing is obviously AS2047. There are some new provisions for outdoor play spaces. These relate to childcare facilities and early learning centres. They primarily relate to barriers and prevention of falls from heights. So fundamentally requiring that the barrier requirements more or less align with the pool fencing requirements in terms of the heights and the strengths and non-climbability of those elements. So without going into detail what they are, I would suspect we'll probably develop some sort of fact sheet in the coming weeks to clarify that. But fundamentally, they relate around outdoor play spaces and making sure the balustrades in those locations are non-climbable. And bushfire. AS3959 will now apply to buildings in bushfire-prone areas of classes 2, 9, and 10A. 10A is the easy one. It's decks and pergolas and things like that adjoining a house. But class 2 and 9 are new requirements. There are a number of state variations attached to this, so particularly in New South Wales. I'd encourage you to sort of familiarise with yourselves with what they are, but fundamentally, overarchingly, bushfire-prone buildings of class 2 and 9 classes in bushfire-prone areas would now be caught up in 3959 as well. In volume 2, so housing, there are some new installation details for solid core masonry. So this is single leaf. This is mostly going to affect I guess the far north Queensland style construction, Townsville, Cairns, so forth, where we have sort of solid core or single leaf masonry construction as the most common or typical construction methodology. Pretty much aligned with standard practice. I don't think that invokes any significant change. I think it's just more a formalisation of what most people are doing anyway, hopefully. They're certainly consistent with the advice that AGWA has provided in the past. We have some new provisions covering the installation of windows. Again, they should be nothing new. These are all fairly common sense, straightforward things that relate to minimum gap criteria, transfer of building loads, flashings, things like that. They're general requirements that would apply to pretty much any installation and represent good building practice. The glass selection provisions, particularly, so what is currently part 3.6, which is now moved to HP or housing provisions 8.3.3 and 8.4.2. These elements relate to glass selection. So they're not new. They are currently in 2019 under part 3.6, but they have been modified and the objective behind that modification is to align them with 1288. There's been some discrepancies between 1288 and what's in the NCC in the past, and we've worked with the ABCB to correct those. We've been mostly successful. There's still a couple of anomalies, but largely inconsequential. Probably the biggest one that we need to be aware of is with regard to HP or housing provisions 8.4.6, which is the glazing in wet areas or bathrooms and spa rooms, en suites, etc. That the clause in the National Construction Code will also apply to kitchens. It's not a requirement in 1288 to consider safety glass in a kitchen, but it is now in the National Construction Code. We have questioned this with the ABCB because obviously you've got open plan living in most homes these days. Where does the kitchen end? What are the requirements? What do the like in bathrooms where you can have a bench in front of a window, in front of a mirror? Are there similar concessions? Does that apply? A whole heap of questions in this space. The ABCB have heard us. They haven't changed their minds, but they have agreed to provide further guidance in the coming weeks, months, undefined timeframe, but we are expecting some further guidance in that space, and we'll keep you informed as it comes to hand. So with all of these changes, we are on the cusp of publishing a couple of new fact sheets. The first one on the left here, as you can see, has got some content which is familiar to you because it's fundamentally what we've discussed in this presentation. The one on the right there's 2 pages. I think there's a total of 9 pages or 10 pages in that fact sheet. That's a detailed summary of the key changes. So that goes through clause by clause, outlining what has changed and basically anything of significance or relevance. So look out for that. Keep an eye out. It is coming out very soon. And it will, I guess, hopefully will be your how-to guide to help you navigate the change process. So this slide here, when we talk about the National Construction Code, the National Construction Code references 130 odd standards, more, about a dozen that affect our industry. So whenever the NCC gets updated, it will typically reference any new standards that have been revised or changed in that time frame. So this table here sort of illustrates the affected standards. And what you can see there is there's 5 standards. All of them have a 2021 revision. So all of these standards have been updated. The black sheep amongst them is AS 1428, which is Design for Access and Mobility, the disability standard. It does have a 2021 revision published, but the NCC will not be referencing the most recent revision. It will reference the 2009, the pre-existing standard revision. So that's largely inconsequential for us, but notable nonetheless. As for the rest of them, I guess once the NCC comes into effect, it will reference the new standards, which means it invokes them into mandatory compliance requirement. We often get the question, okay, so before that, what does it mean? What do I have to do right now? NCC 2022 is available, but not effective. AS 1288, which one am I using, 2006 or 2021? What are the rules here? How does it work? Fundamentally, all of these standards exist and can be used on a voluntary basis. And we would recommend you at least consider using the most recent revision of any standard. It exists for a reason. It's the most current advice. That being said, it's not brought into regulation. It's not mandatory to use it under the National Construction Code until the National Construction Code itself comes into effect. And how that applies in the real world, I suppose, is that development consent is granted on the basis of the standards that applied at the time of consent. So fundamentally, the simple rule to remember is all of these standards come into effect on a mandatory basis for any development application granted after the 1st of May next year. With that, I'll hand over to Poya to talk us through some of the changes that have occurred in these standards. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ross. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Poya Abtahi, and thank you for listening to this part of the presentation. In this part of the webinar, I'll provide a brief update regarding the standard related to glass, glazing, and window industry that have been updated and referenced in the NCC 2022. As you guys know, 1288 as a deemed to satisfy solution, DTS solution, provides some requirements for the selection and installation of glass products in building. The 4th amendment of this standard, the 2021 version, was revised and published last year, June last year. So the main difference between the 2021 and the 2006 version is section 6 and 7, which is slope overhead glazing and barriers or balustrade. So they are the focus of the changes. If you're not either of these 2 spaces, there will be no real effective changes for you. The main benefit of this revision is the usability and also the new scope. For example, for section 6, which is overhead glazing, further clarification was provided on imposed live load requirement for both glazing, overhead glazing with less and also more than 30-degree slope to the horizon. In this version, assessment of the wing load on overhead glazing as a deemed to satisfy solution, DTS solution, is also included in new tables. The current DTS solution for overhead glazing does not cover the three-sided support glass and only provide DTS solution for glass thickness up to 12 millimeter. I'm talking about the 2006 version. Therefore, as part of the scope, the table included in this section were expanded, and new charts were prepared to include those provisions and include glass used in overhead glazing with thickness up to 38 millimeter. The new tables are more comprehensive than before. They can be used for wider range of overhead glazing with different thickness and dimension. So in general, everything is gathered in a very few compact and handy charts to help you guys for select of a glass type, thickness and dimension very quickly for a particular application. So based on the scope of the project proposal, the main intention in section 7, which is about barriers, was to provide further guidance as what is not covered by the standard DTS solution and revise and also clarify some of the ambiguity of the current provisions for a structural barrier with interlinking handle. And also a definition of interlinking handle was also revised due to risk involved with using monolithic toughened safety glass in balustrade or barrier, which protects a height more than 5 meters. In new provisions to restrict using this type of glass has been added. We also added another clause about requirements of a structural barrier protecting height more than 1 meter and referencing to the appropriate test methodology to provide industry with a very simple, accessible, and also uniform prescriptive measure for barrier products testing. So I firstly do encourage you guys to update your copy of the standard and also familiarize yourself with the new provisions. Next one, please, Ross. Thank you. You also be aware that 455 and also AS 1170 Part 2, they were both revised in 2021 as a result of the research and experience from the recent severe wind events, which is Cyclone Debbie. AS 1170 Part 2, which provides a detailed wind load design, is mostly used by engineers, but definitely very important for our industry as well. The 2021 version of this standard is referenced by NCC 2022. This standard provides a detailed procedure for determining wind action on a structure. So the key changes here is that a new indices called a climate change multiplier, MC, is introduced for cyclone region B2, C, and also D. Further clarification is provided for impact test speed of windborne debris when the impact surface is not vertical. Basically, the wind region map of Australia is withdrawn with different sub-region boundaries. And new regional boundaries have been defined as A0, B1, and B2. So in the East Coast region, B1 is extended west to the 200-kilometer line. Next one, please. So factor FC and FD for cyclone regions have been removed from the previous edition of Table 3.1. Regional wind speed for region C have been reduced by almost 5%. Wind direction multiplier, which is called MD, has been revised for all regions in Australia and New Zealand. Another notable change is the removal of TC 1.5, carrying category 1.5. This means that all water surfaces would fall under TC1, which is called carrying category 1. Therefore, as per the requirements, open terrain with a few or no obstruction and all water surfaces, including river, canal, bay, lakes, and also ocean, fall under TC1. Next slide, please. So when it comes to wind load assessment for building, we tend to refer to either 1170 Part 2 or 455. 1170 Part 2 is a primary wind load assessment standard, and AS 455 is a simplified version of it, and it's used especially for determining wind rating for housing only. So same as 1170 Part 2, which I described above, 455 has been revised also last year. A lot of content in 455 is reproduced from the scope of 2021 version of 1170 Part 2. So they are pretty much have the same scope. One of the major changes that we'll notice is the map of Australia is also redrawn in 455 2021 version. It means that region B has extended 100 kilometers inland in the east side of the country around south of Queensland and north of NSW, and also extended further south in the west coast. I highlighted both of them as a red in the image. So we do not have region B1 and B2 as per 1170 Part 2. So the map of 4055 is slightly different from 1170 Part 2. So any development in this area will have increase in the wind load stringency. In some regions of Queensland, the wind load is going up to around 80%. So that's a fairly big jump. And it's very important to understand because it does change the outcome of the equation when you put the new numbers from the new tables in 2021 version. And next slide, please. So same as 1170 Part 2, TC 1.5 has been removed. Anything that was TC 1.5 is now considered as 1, TC terrain category 1, which is including enclosed and unenclosed water bodies. So that's another small but very significant, but significantly increase the stringency that coupled with the regional mapping. This could mean that the wind rating of many houses could increase from, let's say, N2 to N3, and in some cases, maybe from N3 to N4. So also further clarification of shielding parameter was also provided in 2021 version. So if you have any question in this regard, please contact us. We do have in-house training course for 4055 and also the calculator, 405 calculator, which helps you guys for assessing a wind rating for housing. Next slide, please. We also have an updated 3740, which is about waterproofing of domestic wet areas. This standard was revised and restructured last year, and mainly to improve usability. Additional figures and also very clear drawings are added in the new revision with some example of different application. Water stop around enclosed and unenclosed shower has been also updated as well. Next slide, please. So in response to the recent revision of 1288, 1170 Part 2 and 4055, we have developed 3 technical fact sheets to inform members about the critical changes in the standard that will come into effect in line with the guideline that Ross has mentioned earlier in this webinar. So the fact sheet related to AS 1288 provides details of all changes in section 6 and 7 regarding barrier and overhead glazing. As I mentioned, we do have 2 fact sheets for 455 and 1170 as well. I highly recommend you guys to download the fact sheet from AGWA website, familiarize yourself with the new changes. And as always, if you have any question about what is changed, please feel free to contact us. And that's end of my today presentation, and hope you guys enjoy, and thank you for your attention. Over to you, Clinton.
Thanks, Boya. Lots to take on board there. So I guess what is of interest to everyone is that it's clear to see that we've been quite busy and there's been a lot to digest, but we've also been working through what these changes mean, and particularly in the energy efficiency space. We're in the middle of a project at the moment looking at our energy efficiency, and I guess if we go to the next slide. The project is looking at a number of key centres around Australia. So you can see this map at the moment. We're looking at modelling what 7 stars looks like in each of those key capital cities as well as Townsville. And to complete that modelling, we've actually commissioned the design of a single-storey 3-bedroom house and a double-storey 4-bedroom house to try and give us some indicative ideas of what these changes mean. We're halfway through that study, and we'll be probably organising in the coming month another webinar to go through the impacts in the different zones. But as you can see, covering most of the capital cities, and it's fair to say that there are quite a large number of variables at play. As Russ outlined, if you look at the next slide, there are a lot of changes and the adoption frameworks vary, but also the stringency varies. In the AGWA model on the map you saw before, there's 8 climate zones. Then on top of that, when you look at the NATIS compliance pathway, we have quite a large number of climate zones that have their own energy target. If we look at what does 7-star mean, if we take climate zone 60, which is Tullamarine in Victoria, under 6 stars, it had a requirement of 138 megajoules per metre squared as the old 6-star energy target to basically get below. At 7 stars, that target is now reduced to 99 megajoules. But equally, not only do you have to get under the 99 megajoules, but you have to make sure that your heating and cooling loads are below the individual heating and cooling targets. Now, on face value, many of you go, well, the heating and cooling targets are the combination of the heating target and the cooling target would give you the total for 7 stars. That is not the case. What we found when we originally modelled it was in the consultation, climate zone 60 as an example, had a 95 megajoule target for heating. Sorry, it had an 82 megajoule target for heating and a 22 megajoule target for cooling. What we found when we did some modelling and others found was that basically was quite a high bar to try and get under. So not only did you have to get under your 99 megajoules, but no more than 82 of the megajoules could be used for heating, particularly in Victoria, which is a cooling predominant climate. A lot of houses were actually having to go to sometimes up to 7.6 stars to be able to pass the individual heating target. And so the ABCB took that on board. And what we're actually finding here is highlighted in the red circles is a revision to that target. So 95 megajoules on the heating and on the cooling, the 27 megajoules, they've revised those targets up to give basically more room for houses to pass. So it's a 2-stage pass process. You have to pass your 7-star individual total target, and then equally your design has to be able to pass the individual energy target to not more than either the heating and cooling load. And that's basically to allow for, if I'm honest, design that's not necessarily as optimized as it could be for the lot or for the orientation of the building. It's interesting to also note that 7-star target, as an example, at 95 megajoules, is called 7 stars, but it was actually originally published in the RIS as the 6.5-star target, just to confuse everyone. So there is a fair bit of change there. Your energy assessors will be aware of that, but it's important to understand there's 2 parts to the energy assessment process. If we go to the next slide. When we look at 7-star in Tullamarine, we've modelled what 6-star looks like. And let me bear in mind, there is a lot of variation in terms of the orientation. This house in particular, which, we've got our family of 4 with a dog, this is the worst orientation, or the specification in the worst orientation. What we find in the cooler climates, or in this house in the cooler climate, being Tullamarine, is about a 0.3 to a 0.4 star variation, depending on which way it's orientated. And quite a lot of change in the specification. You'll see here that at 6 stars, it had a roof blanket of 1.38. It had R5 installation in the roof. That's had to increase to R6. It had 900 and 1200 diameter fans. They're now at 1200 and 1400. The underfloor on the second story, underfloor installation went from an R3.5 to an R4. There was still internal insulation between the unconditioned areas like the garage wall or laundry walls. The roof went from a from a tile mid-color to a dark colored color bond, try and harness that solar heat radiation. The external walls went from 2.5 to R2.7. The underfloor, the concrete insulation increased to a 375 waffle pod. The downlights in the house had to go to IC4. All of you going, what is IC4? IC4 is basically a make of downlight that allows you to put insulation over the top without burning the house down. And in this case, this house had a 23.8% window to floor ratio with a U value of 3.4 and an SHGC variance of 0.47 to 0.54. Quite a high specification for this house. What we required to do to try and get it passed was we actually had to drop the window or the glazing area down to about 20.4%. And the fixed windows moved to a 2.2 U value, the sliding window is 2.65, and the awning window is 2.83. This is, I will stress, in the worst orientation, and it's following all the rules. One of the things that we've found in going through this is that the role of overshadowing in the cooler climates, we're all aware, we drive past those large outer suburban housing lots. They're very, very tight blocks, generally speaking, with not a lot of gap between them. And the NATAS rules, as they're designed, require you to model shadowing. And that effectively has about a 0.3 to a 0.5 of a star impact on the house specification. And we're seeing that come through. However, if we go to the next star, if we look at the next slide, if we look at what we're currently seeing in the CSIRO data portal, you'll see in blue is the current specification for 6 stars, and in orange, the current specification for the small number of houses that are currently being built at 7 stars. As you'd expect, the U value, peak moves closer to that sort of U value of 3, and the SHGC drops along with that performance and the availability of the glass for many of those products. This doesn't show that impact that we just saw in the previous model in terms of the mid 2s in glazing performance. And that is driven by a large part, what we found in trying to work out what's going on. You'll see in the bottom left-hand corner that currently Victoria is only modelling, the emissions to NATAS only have shading modelled in 7.83% of houses. Now, if you take the NATAS rules requiring you to effectively model a house with the shading of the neighbours that are in place, or if you don't know the neighbours, you have to assume that your house is next door with the same offsets and heights. It's clear to say that there's actually quite a large amount of under-compliance when it comes to the energy rating itself driving this demand. So if you were asking what does a 7-star look like in Victoria as an example, from what we're seeing at the moment, we're probably more in line with that, mid 3s. If the compliance is, really pushed quite heavily, you're going to be seeing certainly your 2-story houses moving to that mid 2s area, potentially low 2s, depending on the design and the layout, and certainly an increase in the stringency required. It's not in line with a lot of the consultation that we did, and a lot of it relies on what the market is seeing. And we're still working through all of the modelling, in both houses, in both orientations, to give that information. It's also important to note that there are, as Russ outlined, different compliance pathways. So things like the glazing calculator. When we model these houses in the glazing calculator, they're tending to mirror the results that we see in that 7-star sort of orange specification that we're seeing here. And that's because the glazing calculator doesn't apply the overshadowing requirements. Equally, if we move to the next slide, when we move up to Queensland, so climate zone 10, the worst case scenario once again. Now, before, when we were talking about Victoria and orientation, we had about a 0.3 or 0.4 variation depending on which way it was facing on the block. We actually see this house having a 0.7-star variation when you move to Queensland, depending on its orientation. Once again, you can see those highlighted by the orange. There aren't actually a lot of changes. This house at 6 stars is pretty standard. The shale grey roof colour. It's important to note the role of window and roof colour in the new 7-star. It actually plays a meaningful and cost-effective role in I guess, basically delivering compliance. What does that mean? Well, in Victoria, you're going to see a lot more darker coloured frames. The role and the benefit of using darker coloured frames will be clear to most builders, and I think you'll see lighter colour becoming really an unnecessary complexity in those low climate or in the lower latitudes. Equally, if you're looking at the more northern markets, lighter colour frames and lighter colour roofs are really going to pay dividends to the design. What we see in this scenario is that, the roof, we get an extra, I think it's 2 ceiling fans at 900 diameter, and our window at 6 stars is 3.4 in the worst orientation. And if we go to a 20.4, we drop that to a U value of 3. Now, it's important to note in this scenario that Queensland has the, the outdoor fan alfresco area concession. So if you have an outdoor alfresco area, which this house does, and you apply a fan to it, you get a 1-star bump. So in effect, this specification would be at 3.4 with that fan. We haven't done the modelling in this, and we'll certainly be going in more detail when we do the individual analysis in about a month's time, but it gives you an indication of the stringency. Many of you are sitting here, if you look at the next slide, and saying, I'm not seeing those windows in the Queensland market. And if you just float the next slide, Russ, what we are seeing is most of the windows, both 6 and 7 star, are a majority of above 5 U value. And equally, the SHGC is not what you'd expect in Queensland. In fact, what the data from the CSIRO tells us is that for the houses that have used netters, and you can see there's not that many compared to the Victorian modelling, it's probably I think 6 or 7, probably about 10% maybe of the Victorian numbers modelled. What we are seeing is that the SHGC isn't as low, so where you'd see more, I guess, low E coatings and more tinting isn't necessarily being lived out by these numbers. But you are seeing the role of increased shading. You can see here in Queensland, 34% of the houses are using shading because it actually helps them in their modelling. We're looking at 7 star. I see no reason why everyone won't be applying shading to their modelling, because it's basically a free kick in the modelling process in terms of the specification. Equally, what we believe may be going on, and why we're seeing such high U values in the Queensland market, is the role of ventilation. I know there aren't a lot of awnings sold in Queensland, but as an example, what we do find is when you apply the role of restrictors on the 2nd story, particularly of our 2-story building, the impact of the restrictor actually changes the heating and cooling dynamics, permanently cooling dynamics of that building quite considerably. So by modelling the house without a restrictor, which we believe is what is currently happening, you have a huge impact on the specification of glazing currently required. Once again, this is all sort of a work in progress, and we're trying to put together a market by market map to give you more indication, but they're the themes that we're coming out with. Unfortunately, it appears that there seems to be a lot of compliance challenges in whichever market you look at, but it's equally fair that the stringency is improving. We have, for example, just started modelling Townsville, and early indications are that just a simple number of changes with the fan configuration, size, diameter, location, can get the house from 6 to 7 stars. So it's very, very, you'll hear a lot of people talking about this in the papers and in the market. And certainly the builders are very articulate in the cost implications of this, and there'll be indications or situations where it could be a costly outcome. But what we see is it all comes down to good design. Everyone keeps saying good design orientation, and I think that is absolutely key. The idea of having a single design that can be used in all markets, in all orientations, is really probably gone, and you will need to see adaptive modelling and adaptive design. I would hazard a guess that some blocks may be in a situation where you can't get type A, B, and C house, but you can get X, Y, and Z. And alternatively, X, Y, and Z are available on the alternate blocks. Because of the stringency, it is very dynamic and responsive to shading, to airflow, and to orientation, particularly when you get into the heating or the heating requirements going down south. If we go to the next slide. When we look at BASICs, we've done a little bit of analysis to try and sort of sense check the BASICs challenges. The heating and cooling loads, as you can see here, Boggabilla and Goondiwindi and Albury and Wodonga, they're not perfectly aligned, even though you can probably reach out and touch each other across the suburb. But they are pretty much close to each other in terms of the impact on the modelling. So we don't see a huge variance sitting inside the BASICs modelling as it currently stands. We're looking forward to getting a go at the new BASICs DIY sandbox that's out. It hasn't been released yet. But all indications at the moment from the more thorough BASICs tool is that it lines up reasonably well with natters and what we expect there. It is important to note, though, that currently the climate zone 46, which is that area just north of Tea Gardens in New South Wales, heading up the coast, and then also sort of the Coffs Harbour to Grafton area, and then the light green area further north, which is, I think, climate zone 9 and 10, up into Byron Bay and Lismore, that area. And there's 2 pockets up close to the border. They are all currently excluded from the 7-star trajectory. So they won't have a requirement to move to 7-star. They will stay at 6 stars. As more information becomes available, certainly with the DIY tool, we'll be testing that to provide some guidance to members. And I'm aware that New South Wales government has started to do consultation on that. For the next slide. Whilst we're outlining 2022, it's probably worthwhile to outline that we've been now for over 6 months working on NCC 2025. Currently, we've managed to get ourselves a seat on the Energy Efficiency Committee, which is focused this time on commercial. It's not saying that residential isn't within scope, but the key focus of it is commercial energy efficiency changes. We've also got a seat on the condensation working group, which is really important, particularly when you've got jurisdictions like Tasmania articulating that one of the reasons they haven't adopted the energy efficiency measures at the moment is because of the ambiguity or the unknown impact of condensation measures on their building typology down in Hobart. So a lot of robust discussion happening in that area. And the other working group that we're on is the external envelopes working group, particularly around weatherproofing and how it applies both in the residential and the commercial context. So if you've got any thoughts around those, now is the time to engage with our technical team. If you've had examples of issues that have popped up from buildings that you've worked on, or examples that you think would help us articulate an improved position for our industry, the team is ready and waiting to hear and make sure that we're presenting as thorough a picture as possible to shape the incoming changes. Outside of that, we're working on updates to 2208 and hope to try and get that into the new, or to get reference for the 2025. There's the 1117 Part 2 additional changes. There's 4055 changes, and we're also putting in a proposal for change for 2047 to hopefully get referenced for 2025. Just a couple of weeks ago, we met with the ABCB, and they did outline that, as you're all probably aware, the current timeframes have blown out in terms of the 2022 timeframe. And so they're really focused on making sure that any changes that, or any standards that are changed that need adoption in 2025 have a real benefit to industry and to the consumer. And so each one of those will have to have its own business case to try and make sure that we get the support to get it referenced. But the work is ongoing and we're consulting with each of our teams. So once again, if you've got areas of concern with any of those standards, particularly 2208 and 2047, that's a lived experience that you want the team to be aware of as we look to review those, feel free to reach out and let us know. Next slide, Russ. We've get to that fun part of questions. I can see there's quite a few. I haven't looked at them yet, but Russ and Poy, if you want to join, and we might have a go at some of the questions. Russ, I think the first one's for you, mate. J1V5.
That's the verb methodology. Yep. What's the question? Sorry, I can't see. I'm screen sharing.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Do you want me to read it? So J1V5 method for reference building pathway depends on calculations based on ANSI, ASHRAE standard 140. Does this mean any software that utilizes this standard 140 will be able to demonstrate compliance? Should there be some checks and balances such as audited data for NatHERS?
There's a lot of time packed there. The ASHRAE 140 the verb methodology is a verification using reference buildings, therefore defined as a verification method as evidence of a performance solution, which means that fundamentally those elements need to be considered by the consultant or the expert. It's a bit like going to an engineer, right? You rely on them for advice. I guess the short answer is the NCC does a really good job of defining or stipulating what you must do for the DTS solutions. It doesn't provide a great deal of guidance when it comes to performance solution. So therefore, I would say they don't apply, but I think I'd like to take that on notice and clarify that, because I don't think I can answer that without going to the book. That makes sense.
No worries.
So who do I need to get back in contact with?
Nayan would love to hear from you, Russ.
Nayan. Okay, I'll give Nayan.
Careful who you mentor.
Nayan.
They come back and return the favour.
Okay, so the next question is, will this 7-star modelling include skylights or be a reference to sloped overhead glazing?
I think that's a question for me. Yeah, look, the 7-star modelling that we're doing at the moment doesn't look at skylights. We've tried to, the comment I would say is overarchingly, all of it is design dependent. One of the things Russ and I have lived over the last 6 weeks, and we're trying to work through these models, is every small little change you make makes a big impact, and makes it really hard to uncover what the learnings are. In the context of skylights, I would say that there's absolutely a role for skylights potentially in the scenario. It's not something we're currently modelling. There's only so many hours in the day, but I would think that certainly in the cooler climates, Victoria would, as a comment, be quite rewarding to the introduction of skylights, particularly that overshadowing scenario that we're talking about. However, when we're looking at the challenges in, say, a 2-story building, like what we were running through before, a lot of the real benefit for that overshadowing comes in the living areas, and most of those are on the bottom floor. So the role of skylights getting that traction could be limited. I think what we will see is a lot more, glazed staircases that allow not only that northern light to come through where it's appropriate in design, but I could imagine the role of skylights playing a role in that atrium type staircase as well. But I think that was Velux asking the question. Happy to talk to you a little bit more around how you can create some of the learnings out of that process, and we can talk. Russ, is there anything I missed on that?
I think the second part to the question was with regard to sloped overhead. And I'd suggest that there are, I guess, exemptions, or there are provisions in section 6 of 1288 which talk about skylights, and what's the difference between a skylight and a sloped overhead glazing in terms of the scope. So again, it's been a while. I think that was sort of work we were doing in 2020, 2021. So it's a while ago now. But I'm pretty certain the reference to 4285 was, I guess, the delineating line in the sand, I suppose. If it complies with 4285, the provisions normally wouldn't apply. If it doesn't, then it's considered sloped overhead glazing, and they would. But I think another one to take on notice and to clarify. Corey, have you got anything to add to that? Do you know off the top of your head?
No, you're completely right. Skylight and overhead glazing, that the only difference between them is the testing. So if you test them based on 4285, then that's skylight. Otherwise, it's overhead glazing. That's the difference.
Yeah.
I think it was mostly focused on energy though. So yeah,
Yep.
cool.
Yep.
Next question.
Okay. Next question is, why are the targets being increased and not made more difficult to meet? It seems counterintuitive.
Not being increased, but
That's Jamie. I don't know if you want to have a chat, Jamie.
Jamie, look, I think the targets, certainly in terms of energy, I think is your question, but feel free to put a chat in. I think the targets are being increased in terms of and being more difficult to meet. I think there's probably an extra layer to that question that I'm not picking up, but
I don't know if he's still in here. I can allow you to talk, Jamie.
You want to stick your hand up, Jamie?
Oh no, he's just gone.
Oh, he's here.
Jamie, feel free to reach out, but I would suggest certainly the general provisions, as Russ outlined, increased stringency, and certainly on the energy front, we're seeing increased stringency. The question at play is probably the level of compliance in all parts of the supply chain to those increased stringency. We will see a improvement in pretty much every specification. The challenge will be how much that is focused on by each of the jurisdictions in terms of how the houses are modelled.
Jamie should be able to talk if he wanted to add, but he may not.
No worries, give us a call, Jamie.
On mute.
No. Okay. I
think
I've got
Scott's
another
saying.
one. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think Scott's saying infographics show people. Yeah, certainly we're trying to make the next energy focused webinar as clear as possible in terms of providing clear guidance as to what it means. But with all these things, it is design specific.
Yep. Then we've got UPVC entry doors for a 5 to 15 millimeter threshold will be difficult, in particular for an open indoor. On the base externally, we have drainage weep holes that cannot be covered up.
Yes. And that is something that we have raised with the ABCB. I'll take this question in relation to the livable housing provisions. It's certainly going to be difficult in some instances to weatherproof an opening when you can't have a sill on the door, a proper sill, especially in sort of high wind load or exposed locations. So that is all part of the mix. The advice I have from the ABC, well, certainly the rebuttal they've provided is that the majority of houses will be accessible, or the accessibility requirements will be met through an internal garage type access way. So it's not likely to affect a large number of buildings. And the other thing that they've outlined or conveyed to us is that there is more than one way to meet the weatherproofing requirements, and the provision of a veranda or a large shelter over the opening may be necessary to meet both provisions. I don't know what that does for air infiltration, but this is the advice. We've got obviously conflicting agendas here. Making houses weatherproof and accessible is a challenge.
Okay, cool. Thanks. The next one is from Stuart, and it's Marybeck City Council in Inner Melbourne is recommending in its guidelines for ESD for 2 to 9 dwellings that window and door frames be in a light to medium colour, which differs from the AGWA modelling for dark frames. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'd like to jump on this because this actually came up a week or two ago, and I'll just do a shout out to Nayan actually for raising this with us. The NAHERS guide actually talks about light coloured frames being advantageous in all climate zones other than 8, I think, or maybe just 7 and 8. It's not accurate. We have taken that to the NAHERS administrator. They've verified that darker coloured frames are beneficial in colder climates, and I would suggest whatever council that was, I would suggest their advice has been predicated or based on the NAHERS advice. And I would encourage them to reconsider that advice because it's wrong.
The only thing I would say, Russ, is we have only currently with our modelling done detached dwellings. We haven't done any sort of multi-story. One of the things I would say is it is so very design specific. It sounds very counterintuitive, and I would suggest they are probably wrong, but we haven't looked at multi-residential or multi-story buildings in the analysis that we've done to date. Except to say that everything we've seen today has been very responsive, generally speaking, to colour.
Okay, and another one we've got is, will the introduction of thermal brake systems become more common in WA to be more compliant? Do we need to consider better performing systems?
Look, I would say with that question, and feel free to jump in, Russ, but at the moment, we haven't completed our WA analysis yet. So I'd ask to hold off maybe a month before I answer that question. I think you're going to see increased scrutiny, certainly with the timeframe delay that the WA government has announced for 2025 being now into play with the energy efficiency provisions. It's less of a challenge. There will be thermally broken frames required in WA, certainly in Albany and some of those colder areas, but a lot of it will come down to sort of, I guess, the design. If you're wanting large areas of glass and you have an architectural home in particular, I would imagine you will definitely need it thermally broken. But let us finish the modelling and then come back to you and present what that means more clearly. But it certainly seems to be increased. I wouldn't suggest it be a big part of the market in Western Australia at this time, but we haven't finished the modelling yet.
Yeah, I guess in terms of broad trends, though, larger homes are more sensitive to, and more difficult to achieve compliance. So the bigger the floor area, the harder it is, the higher the spec required. And equally, the same thing applies to glaze area. The modelling we're doing is proving highly sensitive to the amount of glass, the amount of the surface area of the windows. So if you, as Clint said, if you've got a large house and it's got a lot of glazing in it, you are going to see quite a big difference in the type of specification you'll be talking about. You're almost certainly going to be talking about thermally broken double glazed.
The flip side of that is if you are in a mixed climate, as potentially Perth and Sydney, etc., or you're in a cooling dominated climate, don't underestimate the role of natural variation. So potentially, if you get given a specification, particularly if it's got a low U value, I would question whether they've maximised the ventilation potential of their design. We're seeing lots of instances where potentially, higher opening windows without restriction can improve ventilation and make a huge difference to the specification. And equally, the role of fans. As the building gets more airtight and I guess more insulated, the role of fans, regardless of the climate, can't be underestimated.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, a couple of questions that have come up. So yes, the recording will be available from the AGWA website towards the end of the week, and the fact sheets will be available again from the AGWA website. If not this evening, then definitely early in the morning. We're just doing some final changes based on some of the WA announcements that came through earlier in the week. So they'll be up very soon, and we will send through the links, but generally they're available on the AGWA news page is probably the best place to go. The fact sheets will be available on the news page, plus also on the technical fact sheets links within the member site, and the webinar will be available via the news site or also via the webinars page. So a couple of different spots where you can go to get that. Anyone else that has any other questions just before I know we've sort of gone a little bit over time now, but most people are still involved and engaged. So, yep, if there's no other questions, feel free to email the technical team or email us directly, and we can send that information as best to our knowledge through to you all. If not, have an amazing afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for your attention, and we look forward to speaking with you soon. Thanks, everyone. See you later.